So Matt from Arizona wrote in and he asked a great question. I got his permission to read his question on this show today because I thought that the answer is important. It's one I get asked a lot, and I think it'll bring a lot of clarity to things. So here's what Matt writes. He says, "Thank you for your website and your resources." And he's talking about contagiousdisciplemaking.com. We've got a lot of free resources there and low-cost resources there. In fact, we've got a webinar coming up on August 24th I'd love for you to be a part of. You can register there on the site. He says, "I'm going through the material now. I have a question in regards to your Discovering Obedient Scripture list. Maybe you can answer. I noticed there are 127 scriptures on the list, and some of them are kind of hard, in my view at least, to figure out how to answer the questions. For example, the first one is Matthew 3:9. Do you recommend the group reading the verses before and after the one verse to figure it out? Also, do you ever do more than one or cluster the commands together? I'm obviously new to this and have questions. Thanks so much, Matt." Well, first of all, Matt, thank you for allowing me to answer your question online. I think it's really going to help us out. And I want to give you some history behind things. About 10 years ago, when I was just starting off in everything and movement, I'd followed my dad for a while, but this is me stepping foot into ministry myself. I was asked to be involved in a group that was hosted by City Team, that was funded by a foundation, to basically gather all the scriptures we had been using to disciple people in various contexts and in various stages of their journey in relationship with Christ. And we were to put them together in lists and make those available around the world. And the idea was then people would go out, they would test those scriptures, then they would come back, we would make adaptations, we would send them out again. So we met 3 different times. We met in Sweden twice, we met in Thailand once, and the reason we met there is because it was easier for some of our brothers from Africa and other countries to get visas there than it was in the United States. And so we went there, and it was a multi-ethnic group, it was a multi-gender group, and there was a wide diversity of age ranges there. I think I was the youngest person in the room. And there was also a wide variety of education experiences, from people who had master's degrees, doctorate degrees from Bible colleges and seminaries, all the way down to undergrads, me, from a state college, a state university. So we came together and we began to work on the process, and we started creating different lists. The Discovering God list came out of that. Discovering Obedience to the Commands of Christ through the Gospels came out of that. Discovering Church Planting came out of that. And there was one other that slips my mind. I believe it was Discovering Church and what the nature and functions and everything of church was as well. So we ended up breaking up into different task force, creating those lists, and then pushing them out there for people to try. Now, unfortunately, back in those days, the online collaboration tools had not really come to a point where they were easy to use, particularly in countries that didn't have fast internet access. So we didn't get the turnaround like we wanted to in testing the lists, and people just started doing their thing with the lists and dividing them up as they needed to and trying it on the field, and getting feedback became very, very difficult. And so we ended up having the lists as they stand right now. And the intent was to give a core set of lists that people would use as a launching pad to develop their own lists to disciple different peoples. So that's where all of that came from and was there. I was on the task force specifically to develop the Discovering God passages. And I remember we wanted to choose passages from Genesis to Jesus that would cover 8 attributes of God, that would allow enough overlap that if we needed to leave some stories out that we could, and it would still communicate the minimum amount of information about God and His sovereignty and sin and the need for Christ that someone would need to fall in love with God and to begin and to make a decision to follow Jesus and to be baptized. So that's where all of that came from. So the idea with the scripture list is that you're supposed to be able to take them and adapt them to your needs. Some of them it's easier to do than others. So the Discovering God one, we don't like to adapt that one that much unless there's some real cultural things that have to happen, because we want to make sure we're going from Genesis to Jesus and we're not getting so short that people don't have enough information to make a decision or enough experience with God to make a decision to follow Him. So we have had some adaptations though. We see people adapt the list for people who come from a more animistic background, or a Buddhist background or a millennial background, and try different things there, following that main principle of how do we help them go from Genesis to Jesus, or from the Old Testament to New, and develop an understanding of God. One of the adaptations was from a brother in a closed country. They were doing a Discovering God passage, and they called me one day and they said, hey, we're getting to the passage on the Passover, which we included in because it covers substitutionary atonement. And we're now getting accused of trying to turn our people group into Jews. And that is not good. It's stopping it in its tracks. Can we leave the passage out? And I said, sure, leave the passage out, because we include the story of Abraham and Isaac, which also covers substitutionary atonement later down the road. So they left it out, and from then on never had any problems. And so occasionally we find places where we need to leave some stories out and add them in. Here's the principle, though, in selecting passages of Scripture. Try to pick ones that the simple truth, read and understand by someone with a low education or experience with the Bible, or even a child, can be obeyed and followed in their life and remembered and passed on. Okay, so that's a lot of times why we stick to stories. Now, the discovering obedience passage, Matt, that you brought up, we were just trying to create a list of all the different commands, and sometimes you get verses where like there's multiple commands in one verse. And so we ended up making the list, and looking back on that, I think and I wish we had done a lot more to expand it and include the context. And so here's what I'd recommend for you. Yes, please expand the passage, read the context, understand that that may include multiple commands, that different members of your group, if you do it as a group, which is an advantage, and I would suggest you do, will pick out different commands, and their obedience statements combined with everyone from the group will help you develop an overarching understanding of what the passage is about. So that's what I would recommend. So yes, include the context, allow the group to do it. If the commands are confusing, because some of them are no doubt, then I would put those to later, and I would push forward the commands that are obvious, that people can grasp right, from the get-go. It doesn't matter their experience with Christ or their exposure to Scripture or theology or systematic theology or anything like that. So that's what I would go with. That's what I would advise. I ended up doing that for a group later, and I don't know what I did with that document. I know it's printed and I know it's somewhere, but I have to be able to find it on my computer, and ended up developing a different Scripture list for some other things too, using the same principles. So yes, use it as a starting block, expand it out, and then see what happens. Test it and get back to me. See how it works. Talk to me about that, because that's what I love about the feedback that we're now getting, is that it's allowing us to go in and to change things. And then as we get your feedback from trying it, we're able then to make adjustments and then disseminate that to people around the world who are using the lists. The one thing that I would suggest that you not change would be the questions. The questions for the Discovery Bible Study were chosen because they drive the DNA of reproducing churches into the group just by the very nature of asking the question. You see, DNA is something that you do, it's not something that you know. And the questions help drive the action that embeds the DNA so reproduction can happen. In many cases where I find that reproduction is not happening, it's because one or more of the questions were omitted for one or more different reasons. So I would suggest sticking with the Discovery questions in the Discovery group, but feel free to experiment with the lists. Also feel free to develop your own. We know people who've created lists around marriage, around parenting. I created a list around based off of something my dad did. I created a list around spiritual community off the one another passages. In fact, that's one of the more recent ones that we've created. And you'll notice there's context included in that one, and things like that. So feel free, get in there, have fun, get people reading the Bible. There's nothing that's going to go wrong if you have people reading the Bible and learning about Jesus and talking about it in community and seeking to obey it in their life. So, at any rate, thank you for your questions. Please, if you have any questions about anything regarding disciple making movements, contagious disciple making and its application in the United States and around the world, shoot me an email. My email address is P as in Paul, P Watson at contagiousdisciplemaking.com. You can go to our website at contagiousdisciplemaking.com and see more of the resources and register for that webinar that I was telling you about. We offer a monthly webinar, and you can find the registration for our current webinar there. And as always, I am your servant in disciple making, and don't hesitate to contact us. So God bless, and Matt, thank you so much. I appreciate it.